Nutrition Depot, your fitness fuel. Welcome back for another episode of Nutrition Depot Podcast. I'm Hannah Bacani, your host. And again, following our Nutrition 101 series, we have round 2 of Diet Wars. Dun, dun, dun. This time, Diet Wars is keto versus low carb. And we have back again, Jo Sebastian.
Yes. Let's do it.
Let's do it. Roll up your sleeves, girl. Another round this time.
I need my headband.
Your sweatband. No, the last episode was really something. Like, it was hard to choose.
A battle.
Yeah.
I don't know about hard to choose, but like...
If you haven't seen it yet, check it out. The episode before this. Jo Sebastian is a registered nutritionist dietitian who graduated BS Community Nutrition from the University of the Philippines Diliman, founder of Heal and host of the Donut Box podcast. Jo's goal is to make nutrition fun, easy, and accessible with a focus on having a healthy relationship with food and body.
Yes.
My gosh.
That's me.
That's you. That's you, girl. No, you know what? This is such an interesting episode because I didn't even know there was a difference.
Ooh, okay. Yeah. And I think that's actually going to be a great place to start. There is a difference between just regular low carb and your keto diet. Okay. But let's find out what.
Yeah, let's find out what it really means. Yeah. So how would a nutritionist explain the concepts of keto and low carb?
Okay, so when we talk about your balanced diet, for example, starting there, we usually consider 3 of your macronutrients, being your carbohydrates, your protein, and your fats. So when we talk about the keto and the low carb diet, these are you're shifting basically the amount of carbs, protein, and fat ratio, where you're decreasing the carbohydrates and increasing the other 2. Depending on what iteration of low carb you're doing, it could be a high protein or it could be a high fat version of a low carb diet. So essentially, you're decreasing your carbohydrate percentage in your diet.
What's the difference between a ketogenic diet and a low carb diet?
So the difference between your ketogenic and your low carb diet is usually in the amount of protein and fats and also carbs. So when we talk about your low carb diet, this usually ranges anywhere from 100 to 150 grams of carbohydrates.
That's already low carb?
Yeah, that can already be considered low carbohydrate, or at least lower than 100 carbohydrates. Now, when we're talking about your ketogenic diet, this is a very low carb diet. Usually, we're talking less than 50 grams of carbohydrates. We're also talking 10 to 20% protein and 70 to 80% fat. So a regular low carb diet wouldn't necessarily be high fat, but your ketogenic diet is considered more of a high fat diet.
Would ketogenic diet be under the low carb diet, or is it like a fruit of the low carb diet?
I would say it can be, if we're doing an umbrella, it can be under there. Okay. But keto is more considered a high fat diet rather than it is considered a very low carb diet. Or at least when we're talking about it nutritionally, we're considering more of the increase of your fat consumption rather than simply just removing all carbohydrates. We're also considering that because it plays a big role.
So would it be then the same amount of calories but just different composition?
Yes, exactly. Okay. That's basically what your low carb and your keto is. You can have the same amount of calories, but the amount of protein, carbs, and fats differs.
Interesting. How do these diets approach weight loss and overall health if it's the same amount of calories as a regular balanced diet?
So one aspect of it is let's say somebody who just starts that diet unknowingly can create a calorie deficit because you are kind of restricting a big food group. Right? You're no longer eating rice, your bread, your pastas, and your crackers.
Yeah.
So because you're no longer having these food items, you can unknowingly create a deficit.
Interesting.
But on the other hand, let's say you are having the same amount of calories. Like you are aware of the calorie intake that you're having. Weight loss can happen. Mainly one aspect is due to water loss. So usually when you're consuming your carbohydrates, for every 1 gram of carb that you consume and store, 3 to 4 grams of water is stored alongside it.
Oh.
That's why, yeah, exactly. That's why most of the time when you have like athletes and then they're like, okay, we're going to pump. Yeah, I need a pump, right? They usually have carbs and their refeed days. They consume those carbohydrates because it stores more water. It gives you a little bit more of that pump. And now if you're cutting out a lot of carbohydrates, you're also probably going to release a lot of those glycogen stores, and then you're losing water weight. So not all weight loss is fat loss. Yes. And that's a big aspect that we have to consider when you are starting off your low carb diet, where you're like, oh, yes, it's working for weight loss. I lost so much weight. Doesn't necessarily mean you were losing fat. And we have to consider that.
Now, I think when ketogenic diet and low carb diets became a thing, it was such a shock to everybody because it was so fast. Like you lose weight so fast and they think it's fat immediately.
Exactly. And everyone is like, I can eat bacon now.
Yeah.
Let's go.
Yeah.
There's like that big shift. And so interestingly enough, in the 1980s is when the low carb diet started, like the trend of that. But before that, your low fat diet was the thing.
All the rage.
Yeah,
the 90s.
Exactly. Everyone was like, okay, let's go low fat.
Everything was low fat and diet.
Yeah. At that time. So you can see like it's a lot of trending things happen.
Yeah.
And then a lot of food products that were being sold in the groceries were now low fat.
Yeah.
But then they did increase a lot of the sugar content because flavor tends to come from fat. So if you're reducing the fat, you got to have flavor from something else, sugar. Now, the thing is, now we're seeing people gaining weight because they're focusing more on those low-fat food items. And now everybody is thinking carbs are the enemy.
Yeah.
And that's when the Atkins diet came in, paleo diet came in, and then it became another trend. And now everything is focused on low carb.
Yeah.
And because you lose a lot of water weight, you're like, yeah, this is the one that works.
It is. Dieting is so trendy.
Yes.
Pretty much. But it doesn't have to be.
Exactly.
It doesn't have to be. Let's get into the low carb diet first.
Okay.
What are the different approaches to low carb dieting and how do they compare? Is there a range?
It can definitely depend on the individual's needs. So sometimes we'll do moderate to low carbohydrate, especially let's say you have diabetes. We'll often go to a moderate carbohydrate intake. And that can go in percentage. So usually we'll do 45 to 65% is your carbohydrate intake. And then we'll just go around that range. Or you can also go through carbohydrate grams, where it could be anywhere from 100 to 150 grams of carbohydrates, considering that to be your low carb. Now, the rest of your calories will be distributed with protein and fat depending on your needs. So maybe you'll need a bit more protein or a bit more fat, but it doesn't really have a lot of strict guidelines of like, okay, it has to be like 70% fat or so on. It's a little bit more free in that sense when it comes to the protein and fats.
I like how the low carb diet gives you that flexibility and you don't have to overeat the fats like the ketogenic diet.
Yes, like there's no strict rules of how you can distribute your other calorie needs. Of course, it depends on the individual's needs, but generally it's a little bit more flexible.
Yeah. With that added flexibility, could this be like a long-term solution for you? Or is it primarily a short-term solution?
We don't necessarily recommend somebody to go like low carb because carbs are still important. And sometimes we can take it to that level of like, you're now fearing carbohydrates. Everything with carbs tends to like scare you. Yeah. And the Halloween costume is rice. And then you're like, no.
Macaroni, rice for Halloween.
Oh, scary. The scariest thing nowadays. So when you look at it from that aspect where it's like, yes, there is technically some flexibility, but you still have to look at, is it needed to go low carbohydrate? Because if you don't have much like blood sugar concerns, maybe you're an athlete and you're like a runner, then we wouldn't need to go low carb.
So is the history of the low carb diet tied to like a sickness, a disease?
More of its relation. Well, the low fat diet came up because a lot of people started to get heart disease and high cholesterol. And so everyone was like, bring down the fat.
Yeah.
And that's why low fat came up. And then I think that the low carb started to trend. It was actually because of the Atkins diet book. He actually had like 2 iterations of that book, I think.
My mom had one.
Oh, my mom had a South Beach diet.
Yeah.
But basically, there was like a first installment of the Atkins diet that didn't work out. And then the second time he published his book, that's when it started to get the craze.
Yeah.
And maybe it's because of the food, what do you call this, availability and the products that were coming up. Maybe it was because there was also a trend in like other health concerns. Maybe there's diabetes. But I think a big chunk of that was also people starting to feel like they had to villainize carbohydrates.
So they can sell you something else.
I mean, that's how a lot of things work. That's how insecurities work too.
Yeah. Breeding insecurity. It's already hard as it is to choose what to eat. Now we're cutting out like a food group. It's really hard. What do you think are the potential drawbacks or side effects of the low carb diet?
So for me, one of the biggest things would definitely be your relationship with food. That will always be a big concern for me when I consider a diet. It's like, okay, now you may be villainizing a whole food group where people are now going to be afraid to eat that. And I have a lot of clients who always come with me with that fear. They're like, I can't eat rice ever again. I'm so scared. I can't control myself around rice. They develop a scarcity mindset. So another aspect would be your decreased nutrient intake, because other carbohydrates are not just sugar sources. They're also sources of fiber, a lot of micronutrients, your fruits and your veggies. So some people don't know that fiber is a type of carb that your body can't digest. And because it's a type of carb, fiber comes from carbohydrate sources. And that's your fruits and vegetables, your whole grains. And if you're not eating enough of that, you might not be getting enough of your fiber need.
If you're eating low carb and you have that fiber, is that net carbs?
Technically, when you compute your intake, like if you're tracking it online, you when you put carbs, automatically the fiber is calculated already. So technically, it's part of that.
So I have a friend that used to go on a low carb diet, and part of the program was whenever she ate fiber, it would be like minus the carb intake. They would call it like net carbs. Is that included in the low carb diet, or is there a discrepancy with that?
Technically, when you're calculating or you're tracking your intake and then you're like logging in your carbohydrates, whatever carbohydrates you get, usually the fiber is already like part of that. So you don't have to make like an extra calculation for that. However, there are certain programs that would consider veggies to be negligible just because they are quite low in carbohydrates. And so they'll be like, you know what, just eat as much of that, like as much veggies as you want to, and we won't count that into your carbohydrate intake just because it's not, it doesn't really play such a big role.
Yeah.
Maybe in the average individual, that would be fine. But then when we're talking about medical concerns now, where carbohydrate intake is a lot more specific in terms of needs, we would still definitely want to make sure we're tracking or making sure that's enough or that's counted.
So everything.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you for explaining that.
Thank you for the question.
Yeah. I always had that confusion as to if it's included in like the carbs.
Another example is if you look at the nutrition facts of any food item that you buy, you'll see total carbohydrates, and that is usually divided into your dietary fiber and then your sugar. Right. So that means that's the total carbohydrates, and it's not like added carbs, the fiber and the sugar. That is what those total carbs are made up of.
On the flip side, let's get into the more intense version of low carb. The ketogenic diet. What is the science behind the ketogenic diet and its effects on the body?
So your ketogenic diet, again, usually we would consider more of it as like a high-fat diet rather than a low-carb diet, because the ketogenic diet emphasizes the consumption of high fat. So if you look at the ratios there, a ketogenic diet would tell you to consume 70 to 80% fat, 10 to 20% protein, and then 5 to 10% carbs. And the reason for this is because the ketogenic diet wants you to be in ketosis. Ketosis is essentially when your body is now using ketones as its primary fuel rather than glucose, which comes from carbohydrates. So that's why we are looking at a low carbohydrate intake, but we also have to make sure your fat intake is high as well.
How long would it take to get into ketosis mode?
Let's go into like a little bit more of the history first of the ketogenic diet, where the ketogenic diet was mainly created because there was this guy, I forgot his name. This guy.
The keto guy.
Yeah. Essentially, he was working with somebody who had epilepsy.
Mm-hmm.
And they just couldn't find any solution or any medications at that time. But when they when they changed their diet, there was benefits. They saw benefits to controlling the seizures.
Mm-hmm.
So the ketogenic diet is actually a medical diet usually used to help treat or manage epilepsy. But because of the whole low carb craze and trend, these things started to change and develop into more of your fad or weight loss diet, right? So in the question of how long does it take you to get into ketosis, usually in the medical or in the clinical setting, we usually have a loading phase for you to go into the ketogenic diet. We don't actually just go, boom, you're doing ketogenic diet.
It's not immediate.
Yeah, there's actually a loading phase for it to get there. And so that's kind of the thing that we're also looking at, is not to shock your body into suddenly none of that. But there's certain period of time where you have to stay at less than 50 grams of carbohydrates for a period of days before it would be in ketosis. And sometimes any gram above that, you're already out of ketosis. That's why it's very strict. It's not just stop eating carbs. You're also really looking at how much carbs you're actually eating and even how much protein you're eating. Because one thing that people don't really talk about is that if you eat too much protein, you can be taken out of ketosis.
Oh, yeah. There's a limit too.
Because you have so if you've ever seen an amino acid, so an amino acid has like a carbon backbone.
Yeah.
And then you have your amino group attached to it that makes it the amino acid. But in periods where you don't have glucose, your body has the ability to do gluconeogenesis, which is creating glucose from another source. And that is the carbon backbone of the amino acid.
Okay.
Yeah, like a little complex, but basically you can make glucose out of protein, and that can take you out of ketosis, and which is why keto is not high protein, it's high fat.
And you usually use the strip, right, to check if you're in ketosis. Like there's like some litmus test.
Yeah, there's like some people who do that. It's like some blood tests sometimes. So there are ways to check that. Of course, that's if you're like being really strict about it.
Yeah.
I don't think the average person who does keto does that. Maybe.
Is the carnivore diet the same as keto diet?
I wouldn't say so, just because it will depend now on the ratios, right? Because when you're doing carnivore, you're only eating anything from an animal source.
Yeah.
And while that is high fat, that can also be high protein as well, which may not necessarily fall under ketogenic diet.
Does energy that come from fat differ from the energy you get that come from carbohydrates?
In some way, because it takes a bit more time for you to create energy from fats. And that's why your body loves glucose, because it's like
immediate.
Let's get it. Energy, especially for your brain and your blood cells. Like they run on that.
And my happiness.
Yeah, also mentally. But basically, because it's so much easier, your body kind of has a preference for it.
Yeah.
While for fats, there's a few more processes that it has to go through, fat oxidation and so on. But generally, it will come out into the same amount of energy. But it will depend now on the individual, because you also have something called your keto flu, which is, you'll notice some people who go under ketogenic diet, they'll have brain fog, they'll lose energy, because that's not your brain's primary source of energy.
Right.
And so you'll notice that maybe some parts of your body that are not good at utilizing other sources of energy could maybe take a little bit of a hit and like try to gain that back.
Since you have that limit on carbs, even for the ketogenic diet, how do you get your fiber in?
Well, I've never done the ketogenic diet, but so
avocados, nuts, all that stuff.
But then those are high fat, but they will also still contain some carbohydrates, like nuts, beans. Nuts, avocados. They still contain some carbohydrates as well. But generally, that's why most people who do keto will focus on fruits and vegetables, or mostly veggies, as their source of carbs, because it's low carb and will have enough fiber. But that doesn't always mean you're eating enough of that fiber.
Do you think there are supplements to aid the ketogenic diet?
If you are doing the ketogenic diet and you're really not getting enough of the nutrients, that's the biggest drawback of this, is because you're focusing so much on high fat. Your protein and your carb sources are your sources of a lot of other micronutrients as well. So there may be an instance where to get your overall nutrient needs, you may now need to supplement that with, let's say, multivitamins, either fiber supplements even, and in some cases, electrolytes as well, depending on what your overall diet looks like.
Especially for athletes, I'm sure it's essential to supplement if you're on a diet, right? Like this, right?
Yes, although I'm not familiar with a lot of athletes who actually do the ketogenic diet, because most of the time athletes, if you saw like the Olympics, right?
Yeah.
They were
The muffin, the chocolate muffin. They were all eating that up.
They're eating multiple types of carbohydrates.
Yeah.
Carlos Yulo also posted recently. He like showed his
And he likes steak.
and his pasta.
He likes steak and pasta.
Yeah, like he was showing his carbohydrate intake because most athletes really run on that fuel. So I'm not familiar with a lot of athletes who do keto. And I'm not sure if that is the most efficient way as well. But definitely we would probably look into what supplements would aid the missing nutrients around that.
That tells me everything I need to know, I think.
I mean, I hope so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to eat what the athletes are eating because they have to fuel their bodies in the most optimum way with well-researched backup, right?
Yeah, a lot of them have their own dietitians. Like Carlos Yulo has Miss Janeth Aro, who is a Filipino dietitian, right? And she really talks about how carbohydrates plays that really big role, and also how we're structuring our carbohydrate intake throughout your training as well.
Are there any specific health conditions or medications that can interfere with the keto diet?
When we look at the keto diet, and this is also one of the big concerns when you're just online and somebody's like, do keto, like this is the best for you, and you don't know exactly what keto is. All you hear is high fat, that's it. So what's your tendency to do? You're going to go for the chicharron, the bacon, the butter, which, while delicious, can also be an increase of saturated fat. And a common misconception is that cholesterol from food increases your cholesterol in the body, but a bigger impactor to your cholesterol in the body is the type of fats you consume. Saturated fats being one of those food items that increase what is called your bad cholesterol. So when you are now focused on all of these saturated fat food items as your fat source, because you have to eat high fat, we can have those instances of increasing your cholesterol, increasing your bad cholesterol, your triglycerides, and so on. So then our indication for that would be what individuals would be at risk if they were having such a high fat diet. That is going to be those who have hypertension or who might have cholesterol concerns, even those who have kidney concerns, because now they're also having to go through like all of those to process all of that, all of the byproducts of that. And then you also have your diabetics, because while going low carb can be helpful, going high fat can still impact insulin resistance, especially if we're focusing too much on saturated fats.
So what you're saying is consult your physician.
Yes, and your dietitian.
And your dietitian.
Yes.
When you get into any diet.
Exactly.
Yes. Are there any ethical concerns or potential negative consequences associated with these diets?
One thing we have to look at as well is your food sources are likely going to be mostly on the animal products. And if we're looking at sustainability, and I guess we could go as far as climate change and like the earth, we look at that like, okay, this is heavily focused on animal-based products, which is something that we want to look at in that long-term sustainability.
Emissions.
Yes, exactly.
Waves, etc.
Yeah, so we're also looking at that aspect. And then again, we're going back to, is it really helpful for us to just recommend a diet blindly to somebody who you have no idea what's going on? They're going through specific health concerns, and then you're recommending this, and what's that going to be like? Because it can increase the risk of heart concerns or even other health concerns if they're not guided properly.
Wow, there's a lot to unpack here.
Yes.
Yeah, there's so many factors of keto versus low carb. How do we even decide which is better?
Well, I guess we can go to like pros and cons, right? The pros of a low carb diet, or even or like doing a low carb diet, for example. I think the pros of even just thinking about going on a diet is that you're now more mindful of your food intake, but you can also take that mindfulness on a balanced diet as well, right? You know, we just want to focus on mindfulness. So one of the pros would be you're more mindful of your added sugar intake. That's great. Maybe you're being more mindful as well of what sources of carbs you're choosing because you have a little bit more limit to that. Sometimes if there is what they call dirty and clean keto, your clean keto focuses more on unsaturated sources of fat. So that can now promote the individual's intake of unsaturated fats as well. So overall, you're reassessing what your intake is. But we go back to the cons. Any restrictive diet that sets up a bunch of rules can create a negative relationship with food. And also, if we're doing something as strict as the keto diet, you're also limiting a lot of your sources of nutrients because you're not consuming your fruits and vegetables anymore. You can't really consume a high protein diet as well. So now we're looking at that negative side of like nutrient intake is impacted.
Yeah, no, and it's different too if you're an athlete or what you do during the day. I think it's different for the lifestyle that you choose, right?
Yes. I mean, I think one of the biggest concerns we have here is like, how are you going to hang out with your friends? And like everybody's having
a stick of butter.
Exactly. So there's really that thing that we have to consider is, you know, how does that fit your lifestyle?
Yeah.
And is it fun for you to watch everybody eat these foods while you're wanting it too? So I think that's the big thing is you're cutting it out because it makes you feel better, or are you cutting it out just because you're afraid of it?
Yeah.
And that's when it becomes a harder thing, because if you're just cutting it out because of shame and guilt that you feel for it, you're still going to want it.
Yeah. Or if you think that's the only diet that works out there.
Yes.
Because we're going to say that it's not.
Yes. Yes.
The best diet is?
Well, of course, if any dietitian would definitely recommend your balanced diet, because carbs still play a very important role in our nutrition. Aside from fiber, a lot of B vitamins for your metabolism, also your energy source, and it tastes delicious. You know? Your protein is still very important as well. And we look at the role that all of these food items play. So for me, it would be like, let's take some things from these diets rather than having to completely apply it. Like, let's take the idea of being more mindful of the type of carbohydrates that we consume, being more mindful of the type of fats that we consume, and also being more intentional with the way we prepare our food as well. Like, we can take those away as well.
Very mindful, very demure.
Yes. Very intentional.
Very intentional. We love that.
Yes.
Well, we've learned a lot for the past 2 episodes of Diet Wars. So which do we choose today? Who is the winner of round 2 Diet Wars? Is it keto or low carb?
If I had to choose, I would choose low carb just because there's a little bit more flexibility. But even then, again, we wouldn't recommend anyone to just straight up go low carb because it still depends on your needs. And some people will still need moderate intake of carbohydrates. So it doesn't have to be low carb. We can just be more intentional with our carbohydrate intake.
I like that flexibility too. Thanks, Jo.
Thank you.
Thank you for another episode of Nutrition 101. Thank you so much to Jo Sebastian for being back on the podcast. Thank you for watching this episode of Nutrition Depot Podcast, following our Nutrition 101 series. Follow us online, Nutrition Depot PH, on TikTok and Instagram and Facebook. Also follow us on Spotify, Nutrition Depot, as well as our YouTube channel. Thank you so much for listening. See you in the next episode. Bye. Nutrition Depot, your fitness fuel.